if a guest conductor actually brings something that I cannot even come up with. As you know, over the years I can come up with a lot of things. And I remember that early in the year, and I'm afraid I don't remember the name, but there was this Swiss conductor, guest conducting here. He did Shostakovich 5, Baldur Brönnimann.
Yes.
And he brought a piece by a young female Portuguese composer. And I remember I was in the audience on one of the concerts, and I thought like, well, that's actually interesting music. I like it. And so instead of just saying, you know, I don't want to learn another piece, I actually said, let me look. And I looked, and I thought like, the Kokkonen is very interesting. I mean, it kind of fits everything, the program. The only thing that doesn't fit the program is I actually had to Google Leo Hussein in the sense of, wait a second, his name is Leo Hussein. He's not Scandinavian. Because I thought, this is a purely Scandinavian program, so it would be obvious if somebody Finnish or Swedish would do this, but no. So Leo is a Brit. However, the British have a very big affinity to the Scandinavians and their music. Big stuff.
So that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's talk about this first piece then, which was unfamiliar to you when you stepped in to guest conduct this program. Jonas Kokkonen, a Finn, 20th century composer. Tell us about this guy. What do we need to know? Most of us have never heard his music before.
Well, interesting enough, I know a lot of Finnish composers, but they are all alive, and Kokkonen is not. And I learned actually that he wrote the most famous Finnish opera ever written, which is called The Last Temptations. And this opera was even given a premiere in some performances at the Metropolitan Opera in New York many years, maybe decades ago. Aside from that, Kokkonen is a composer that did something that in a certain point in their life, Finnish composers try to avoid. For one reason or the other, they all shy away a little bit from the term symphony, because they think, well, Sibelius is our main composer in Finland. He wrote 7 of them. How can we even dare? Well, Kokkonen actually dared. He wrote a couple of them. And in this case, he wrote symphonic sketches. And the symphonic sketches are exactly what you think sketches are, meaning they bring the material that if Kokkonen would have had the interest, he could have developed into a true symphony, but he actually wanted to leave the work as is. And it's, to me, I really love digging into when composers write something that I think like, some enigma is there, I like to dig up what is there, and I couldn't. So I leave you with the same enigma that I am there, which is, okay, it's a 3-movement piece. So it's 3 symphonic sketches, but it's very interesting because he goes, the first movement is a lament, self-explanatory. The second movement is an allegro giocoso, so he goes very far away from a lament or a dirge or something. And then the last movement is called religioso. So it has, and one thing that Kokkonen does in this composition is late in his life. And he went during his life through very different processes of composing. One of them was 12-tone, and the other was this, and then the neoclassicism, blah, well. And when he was older, like in this one, he sometimes liked to combine things. And the interesting point about this piece also is the combination of different styles, because you have sometimes things that sound fairly modern, you have very layers of sound sometimes that remind you of actually what it is, the later 20th century. And then comes this quite funny, short second movement. And then we go, and I would say at the end of the last movement, we clearly built a cathedral. That's an interpretation. What he really meant, I don't know.
And it's interesting that you say for any Finnish composer after Sibelius, they've got a kind of the figure of Sibelius looming over their shoulder. Oh, difficult to write a symphony because Sibelius did them so well. There's some Sibelius on this program even, so you'll hear the Kokkonen, more 20th century Finnish music, and then this lovely little piece by Sibelius starting the second half.
Well, that is the first movement of Kuolema. Kuolema is the incidental music for a play by Arve Järnefelt, who was a Finnish writer, and Arve Järnefelt happened to also be the brother-in-law of Jean Sibelius. And this Kuolema means death. So it's one of those happy Finnish pieces. And the Valse triste, well, guess what? It's not a happy waltz. Actually, this is a waltz because this is music for a play. So there is a story behind it. There is, in a nutshell, it's this young man who is caring for his terminally ill mother, and he's completely exhausted. He falls asleep, and the mother, in a way, kind of in a dream, wakes up and starts to dance. That's the waltz that you hear, and other kind of magical dark figures join in the dance, and she gets exhausted and breaks down, and then really gets into the dance again, even with incredible energy, until something knocks on the door and everything dissipates and death is there. And that's the end. I told you it's a happy piece.
It's kind of eerie music. It's really fuzzy and hazy, and
it's actually, it's another, I mean, the piece lasts how much? 4.5 minutes, something like that, give or take. It's actually surprising how well this works. Because it's literally, it's Valse triste, it's slow. It's a slow waltz, and it takes a while until it develops. And then you actually hear how, since I told you the story, how the mother spins, how she dances, and how that is taken over by something dramatic. And at the end, with those 3 chords of 4 violins playing alone, it's kind of very, the music at the end loses its weight, which actually could be a synonym of actually dying, because then the body is just there and the soul is somewhere else. Maybe.
I'm glad we do these chats. I'm learning something. So we've talked about the 2 Finnish programs, on Finnish pieces on this Scandinavian program, the first of the first half and the first of the second half. After we hear the Kokkonen in the first half, we welcome to the stage the amazing Andre Watts, who I know you have a heartfelt relationship with.
Well, this is actually a relationship not since the first time I saw. I told Andre, because we have worked together, but separated through years and years and years, I don't know why. He has been here with the Oregon Symphony during my time as music director many times, as he should, but never with me. And now, even this time, wouldn't have been with me, so I'm very glad that Leo had a family emergency so I can work with Andre. And I told Andre that I actually remember him very well from my childhood. I grew up in Montevideo in Uruguay, and he was a guest soloist there, a very, very young soloist, and I was probably 10 or something like that, a young kid going to concert.
And you vividly remember that?
I vividly remember him because, you know, back in Uruguay in those days, the orchestra had actually quite a fairly good level, and we had some interesting. So, I mean, if I look back and I think, wow, when you live in Montevideo in Uruguay, which is, it's kind of far away, and where great soloists visit, they go to Buenos Aires. Montevideo not so much. But back in those days, so the 60s and the very early 70s when I was still there, we had here and there some very interesting people who were either at the start of a very major career or so I remember I remember Andre Watts, major word. I remember Martha Argerich. Oh yeah, I saw her. And I remember Charles Dutoit. All of them came.
Wow.
We are talking of an orchestra where Toscanini had conducted that orchestra. Unfortunately, I couldn't go.
Wow.
I wasn't born.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, but he was there.
What amazing young experiences. How old were you at this point when you were seeing all these major artists? You said 10, 12, something like that?
Anything between, I would say, 8 and 14.
Wow. How formative.
Yeah, of course, it's very formative. However, this is, we are taking off. The interesting point for me is, yes, I saw this, some really great artists, some very interesting artists, you name it. But if I compare it with the booklets that my father actually had. So my father was born in Vienna in Austria and lived there until he was 19, when it was Reichskristallnacht, and he had to flee. But he was an avid opera goer, and he wrote down every performance. And if I read the people that he saw, whoa. We're talking, of course, the 20s and the 30s, so kind of long ago, but he saw the greatest of the greatest. And some of the funny thing is, some of them, conductors mainly, later came to conduct in South America because they were of Jewish heritage and had to flee and had to go somewhere. So he saw them again. But that's history.
But I'm happy for that diversion. Very interesting. Andre Watts is playing the Grieg piano concerto, which is going to sound most familiar, I think, on the program to all of us, of all the pieces today. This monumental masterwork from Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. Is there anything else you'd like to share about this piece, as familiar as it may be?
Well, the pieces came in a way out of an obsession that Grieg had with a different piano concerto. So Grieg, we're talking about a very young composer. He was very young when he wrote this piece, and he actually learned and heard the Schumann piano concerto, and he got obsessed with that. And in a way that led to the composition of this piano concerto. And guess what? Yeah, both pieces are in A minor. Both pieces start with the same kind of boom and go. The difference is that the Schumann starts just with bang, go, and Grieg starts with roll, bang, go. Aside from that, yes, the great thing about this concerto is Grieg definitely found his voice. Meaning it's not, yes, it is created out of maybe an obsession, but it doesn't diminish the quality of the music, first, and second, he found his way of writing in this piece, and it's one of those concerts, and there are quite a number of them where you, I don't know about Andre, and I'm not saying that is his thought, but when you're a conductor like me and you have done this piece many times, you think like, oh, not again. And then you get to do it, and you are just happy as a clam. You're like, oh, my goodness, this is so amazing. And you have Andre there, which is also, that's a major work in piano playing. And then comes the second movement. And you just say, yeah, that is why actually the Grieg piano concerto is one of the most played pieces, because it's just simply that good.
It is.
Yeah.
And I'm zeroing in on that word you just used, obsession, because the more I listen to Carl Nielsen's Symphony No. 5, I think that word really applies to that symphony, musically speaking. Do you feel the same way?
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. So, in essence, the program you're going to hear tonight with the exception of the second movement of the Kokkonen, and with the exception of the Grieg piano concerto in its entirety, is actually bloody serious music. I mean, the Kokkonen two movements are very, very meticulous and very, in a way, have some darkness to them. The Valse triste is, well, the Valse triste. And the Nielsen, boy, God, that is quite a beast. So the Nielsen Fifth Symphony is one out of two symphonies. He wrote 6. 4 of them have names, and that is actually kind of important to know. So number 1 is nameless, number 2 is the 4 temperaments, number 3 is espansiva, number 4 is the inextinguishable, number 5 that you are going to hear has no name, and number 6 is the Sinfonia Semplice, which always makes me joke about it, because you sing Sinfonia Semplice, meaning simple symphony, and there is nothing simple about that piece. And so Nielsen got, of course, the question, so why didn't you name your Symphony number 5? Because we understand Symphony number 1 you didn't name because it was your first, fine. But then you started to name everyone. He said, like, you know, guys, essentially it doesn't matter whether I name it or not, because I'm writing in essence about the same thing. In all my symphonies, they are all similar to each other. Now, the thing is, there is some truth to that in the sense of Nielsen is, although he didn't get the recognition outside of Denmark until probably 1950, 1960, he's definitely a composer with a very distinctive voice. I would, in a way, when you know Nielsen, and you hear a piece that you don't know, you actually can recognize his writing when you are familiar. Now, then in his life he writes his Symphony number 4, the Inextinguishable, and which is in a way an homage to some extent. It's an homage to life. But in this Symphony number 4, he has this very, very famous battle between the 2 timpanists. That, I mean, in the last movement, it's a symphony in 4 movements, and in the last movement there is a battle going on, and that refers, arguably, to the First World War. And then he writes, starting 1920, finishing 1922, he writes number 5, different form, but something very interesting happens in this symphony. So, at least, I mean, I'm talking about what I feel that Symphony 4 and 5 are. In number 4, you have this massive battle going on, but still there is a lot of glory going on, and the symphony at the end, after the battle is over, glows. It is brilliant, and it leaves you with actually a very positive feeling. Then comes number 5, and we are talking about a symphony that is very, I would say, unsettling, especially in the first movement, because it's highly destructive. Meaning, let's put something in front of everybody and let's destroy it in a way. And the second movement is different. So he decided to go for only 2 movements, although the movements are distinctively separated, meaning they have sections, so you can construct something out of that. But the interesting, where Christa actually very rightly said, let me pick up on the word obsession, is, so the first movement starts with an obsession, which is, it starts with the viola and then travels for a long while, which is just an interval. You hear da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di, and you hear it forever. I mean, it's like, what's going on? And the only time when he interrupts that after a minute or so is to introduce a theme that later becomes what we call the evil theme. But at the beginning you don't recognize it. In essence, what Nielsen is writing about is about life. and life as a struggle, and life as a battle, and of course the influences from World War I are, I would say, very, very obvious. But this first movement leaves you, I can imagine, it leaves you to some extent in a little bit of distress, because, so what does he do? He has this obsession, and then life comes in the form of two bassoons, and it's fine, but all of a sudden, without announcement, the bassoons interrupt themselves and kind of start screaming very briefly. And the violas are like, what? And then they go again in this little, okay. And then the same melody from the bassoons is worked in other instruments. Everything gets a little more dramatic. And finally you hear the percussion in a way always accompanying but also interrupting a little bit what is going on. Also, one very clear trademark in the first movement is the use of dynamics, because sometime you will hear it. You will hear this obsessiveness with something that hammers away while the melody gets smaller and smaller. And it gets until to the point where the music disintegrates, and then we are in the second part of the first movement, which is an adagio. And you feel like, oh my God, this is beautiful, beautiful. And it goes on for a while, and it builds momentum. And then in the woodwinds, against this beauty, you hear the evil motive, like, and the beauty, and it builds until we are going to blow up this place. And then comes one of the most interesting parts in this entire idea of composing something like this, which is the snare drum. You have heard the snare drum until then, but all of a sudden, at the climax of this beautiful adagio, with the evil motive constantly hammering away, the snare drum actually takes literally off. So the snare drummer has to play at a different speed than the rest of the orchestra. And it sounds, this is an interpretation, as if there is, gunfights, something like that. And then it dies down, and we are left with this beautiful G major chord, and the clarinet starts to kind of improvise very slowly, and all of a sudden you hear the battle again, and the clarinet takes over, and everything just dies. And that's the first move. It's like, whoa. And then comes the second movement. The second movement is quite different. It's a fast movement, for the most part. And what Nielsen does is he plays melodies in part melodies in very big intervals. Stuff, sorry if you are filming me. I'm not singing very well, but you get the idea. It's highly melodic. Nielsen is in a way late romantic, in a way, kind of. But so he builds very strange melodies, and he cuts them off, and he does this, and again he gets a little bit into something obsessive. You'll hear it. It's very fascinating. And then he speeds up, gets into a fugue. The fugue blows up. You feel like everybody's going nuts on the stage until it dies down, and then everything is very calm, very slow movement, very intense, until we get to the last part where it's fast. And then the symphony ends in absolute glory. And that is the fascination of Nielsen, that he really is so, in a way, destructive to some extent, but it ends on a very positive tone. Of course, he got asked after all of this, so what do you mean? And he barely had anything to say. He probably didn't want to really say. He said, it's kind of the same thing I have said in my all other symphonies, sort of. And if you want a picture, it's the picture of a big stone that you push up a hill, Sisyphus, And then you tie up the stone and it lies there on the top of the mountain quietly, and then you send it rushing down. That's a picture he had for us.
Well, given the way you describe it, I can't wait to hear it. So thank you for describing it so well. And it's been a joy talking about this music with you. But now we need to let the musicians take the stage. So